September 25, 1986. Jalalabad, eastern Afghanistan. The late afternoon air hung thin and dusty over the approach corridor to the airfield, a familiar landscape to the pilots of the Soviet 40th Army. For nearly 7 years, rotary-wing aircraft had ruled the sky. The Mi-24 Hind gunship, armored and heavily armed, had become the airborne symbol of Soviet control. Its silhouette was meant to intimidate, its firepower to suppress, its presence to guarantee that no insurgent force could move freely in daylight. On that afternoon, 3 Mi-24 helicopters returned from a routine mission, flying low along the valley floor. Low altitude was doctrine. It reduced exposure to radar-guided systems and allowed the crews to visually acquire ground threats. The assumption was simple and until then largely correct. The Mujahideen possessed heavy machine guns, anti-aircraft cannons such as the Zu-23-2, and older Soviet-supplied Strela-2 missiles. These were dangerous but predictable threats. Soviet pilots had learned to evade them with speed, terrain masking, and flare deployment. What happened next marked a turning point. From a ridge overlooking the flight path, a U.S.-supplied FIM-92 Stinger missile was launched. It was the first combat use of the system in Afghanistan following covert deliveries authorized under U.S. National Security Decision Directive 166. The missile struck its target with precision. Within moments, another launch followed. In less than a minute, multiple Soviet aircraft were destroyed. For the pilots who survived that day and those who heard the reports, the event was not merely a battlefield loss. It was a revelation. The Stinger did not behave like earlier infrared-guided missiles. It did not require a clean rear aspect shot on the engine exhaust. It did not veer off toward flares with the same reliability as the older Strela-2. It tracked differently. It struck from angles previously considered relatively safe. Within weeks, Soviet aircraft losses increased sharply. Helicopter crews reported missiles that seemed to ignore countermeasures and approach from unexpected vectors. The sky, once assumed to be an extension of Soviet ground power, no longer felt secure. And to understand why that shift in confidence was so profound, it is necessary to examine what Soviet air dominance in Afghanistan had meant before the Stinger arrived. Before the Stinger, Soviet air dominance in Afghanistan was less a slogan than a daily operating condition. The war was fought across mountains and valleys where roads were few, ambushes were routine, and ground units could be isolated in hours. In that geography, air power became the Soviet system's connective tissue. Helicopters moved troops over terrain that convoys could not safely cross, supplied remote garrisons, evacuated wounded, and delivered immediate fire support when a patrol was pinned down. Soviet reporting and Western intelligence assessments from the period note the growing reliance on Mi-24 helicopter gunships and Su-25 ground attack aircraft to improve close air support as the conflict evolved. This way of war rested on two linked assumptions. The first was technological. Insurgent anti-aircraft threats were dangerous but limited. Heavy machine guns and light anti-aircraft cannon could punish predictable flight paths, but they required line of sight, and they were easier to suppress once located. Early shoulder-fired missiles in the conflict, while alarming, generally imposed a known set of risks. Their seekers were less capable, their engagement geometry was narrower, and countermeasures and tactics could reduce the odds. The result was a dangerous but manageable environment in which Soviet crews believed discipline, altitude choices, and defensive measures could keep losses within tolerable bounds. The second assumption was doctrinal. Helicopters were not merely support platforms, they were operational tools. Air assault and vertical mobility allowed Soviet commanders to bypass choke points, reinforce threatened outposts, and pressure insurgent networks that otherwise dispersed into the terrain. When helicopters could fly routinely, the ground war stayed connected. Fuel, ammunition, food, and medical evacuation moved on Soviet timelines. When helicopters could not fly, the ground war slowed, then fractured. The Stinger threatened both assumptions simultaneously. When U.S. deliveries began in late September 1986, reporting soon noted that aircraft losses rose sharply in the period after its introduction, forcing immediate changes in how Soviet aviation operated over Afghanistan. And because the danger was felt first by air crews, often with little warning, the fear that spread through Soviet units was not abstract. It was the recognition that the old rules about where the threat could come from and what could defeat it no longer held. That raises the central question the Soviet engineers and planners had to answer next. What exactly made this missile different? Underneath the dust and mountain sun of late 1986, what made the FIM-92 Stinger such a fearsome new weapon was more than just its presence on the battlefield. It was a technical leap in portable air defense that Soviet aviators had never encountered before. Manufactured in the United States as a successor to earlier shoulder-fired missiles like the Red-Eye, the Stinger was already in service with the U.S. Army by 1981 and represented a distinct generational upgrade in infrared homing technology. At its core, the Stinger was a fire-and-forget missile with a passive infrared seeker that detected the heat signature of an aircraft without requiring the operator to guide it after launch. This type of seeker was rapidly responsive and, by the mid-1980s, had evolved to track targets more reliably across a wider range of engagement angles than older systems. Unlike the early Strela 2M, which struggled to lock onto anything but the hottest part of an aircraft's exhaust and was limited to tail aspect shots, the Stinger could engage from aspects that previous MANPADS could not. Soviet pilots flying Mi-24 Hinds and Su-25 Frogfoots were well aware of the capabilities of shoulder-fired missiles in Afghanistan. Before the Stinger, insurgents had fielded Soviet-made Strela systems and Western weapons like the Red-Eye, but these had severe limitations. They were less sensitive to heat, slower to react, and easier to decoy with flares. The Stinger's seeker, in contrast, could often differentiate between the thermal signature of a target and common countermeasures, and its higher speed and range, operationally up to several kilometers, gave it a broader engagement envelope than its predecessors. What this meant in practice was that aircraft could no longer assume relative safety when approaching from oblique angles or executing flank runs at medium altitudes. Stinger teams hidden in the valleys could wait and fire with a reasonable expectation of a hit, much more so than with earlier missiles. Western sources later attributed a high number of successful engagements to these systems, often reporting a dramatically higher kill probability than previous missiles had achieved. This threat forced a corporate shift in Soviet air operations. Tactics that had been reliable for years, low-altitude insertions, visual attack runs, and predictable ground support routes, became liabilities. Pilots reported engagements from near unexpected directions, and the traditional Soviet reliance on heat-seeking missile countermeasures like flares was put to the test against a seeker far more resistant to simple decoys. But to truly grasp why this missile altered the psychological and operational calculus of Soviet air power, we must look at how aviators and commanders adjusted their strategy in the war's remaining years, often flying higher, slower, and in ways that ceded the initiative to insurgent defenders who once feared the sky itself. Soviet aviators were trained to dominate the sky, but after the Stinger's arrival, their confidence eroded in a way that went beyond simple loss statistics. In the months that followed the missile's first confirmed combat use in September 1986, aircraft losses attributed to the new man-portable air defense system reportedly climbed into the low hundreds, with many resistance fighters claiming high kill rates and Western analysts estimating that Stingers may have been responsible for a significant portion of Soviet aircraft shootdowns. Others caution that Soviet records show far fewer losses, and that claims of hundreds of Stinger kills should be treated with skepticism, but there was no denying that the perception on the ground had shifted dramatically. For Soviet pilots, perception was reality. Reports from the front lines indicate that crewmen increasingly altered their tactical profile, avoiding once routine low-level ingress routes and instead flying higher and more cautiously. What had been standard air assault doctrine, inserting troops, providing close fire support, flying nap of the earth to evade heavier anti-aircraft fire, became much more dangerous when a hidden Stinger team could engage from a valley floor or mountain pass. As one Western military analyst put it at the time, the ubiquity of the Stinger forced Soviet aviation to revise its strategy, with helicopters and ground attack aircraft retreating from low-altitude flights that had once been routine. Psychologically, the effect was profound. Inconsistent but lethal, the Stinger became a legend among Soviet crews almost overnight. Pilots spoke of missiles that seemed to appear from nowhere, of engagements in which infrared cueing systems failed to provide reliable warnings, and of the simple fear that anyone on the ground could be carrying a weapon capable of killing them. Even high-altitude bombing runs, once a safe alternative, became perilous because the Stinger's effective engagement envelope was broader than earlier weapons. It no longer required the simple tailpipe shot that older Soviet-oriented missiles demanded. By late 1987, The consequence of this tactical shift was evident in the air war over Afghanistan. Soviet helicopters and ground support aircraft could still fly, but they did so at greater altitudes, slower speeds, and with much heavier reliance on defensive countermeasures. This tactical conservatism traded some measure of survivability for a loss of effectiveness. Heavy machine gun strafing, close air support, and rapid troop insertions were all curtailed because the risk of crossing into Stinger range was simply too great. The war was no longer fought from a position of unquestioned air superiority. Instead, it became a war of attrition and caution. Soviet commanders hesitated to commit helicopters into contested valleys where Stinger teams might lie in wait. Close support missions were rerouted, often at altitudes above the effective range of many of the very weapons that had once guaranteed operational success. In essence, the Soviet air arm was being forced to fight around the threat rather than through it, and that was a dramatic change in doctrine. But the tactical adaptations were only part of the impact. The deeper effect was on morale. When every sortie carries not just risk but unknown risk, airmen see the sky not as a domain of control but as a landscape of possibility, including the possibility of sudden, lethal failure. It is this psychological shift, perhaps more than raw loss figures, that truly illustrates how the Stinger challenged Soviet air dominance in Afghanistan. In that environment of unknown risk, Soviet commanders had only two options: absorb losses and keep flying as before, or change the entire way they used air power. What followed was a rapid, uneven shift from confident low-level dominance to cautious, constrained aviation, an operational retreat forced by a weapon small enough to be carried by a single fighter but effective enough to reshape campaign behavior. Contemporary intelligence reporting noted that once Stingers began appearing in the east, Soviet and Afghan government air operations were reduced or altered in the affected areas, reflecting an immediate recognition that routine patterns had become liabilities. Soviet crews increased defensive countermeasures, altered routes, and tried to widen the margin of safety by climbing, standoff firing, and limiting predictable approaches. But these adjustments came with trade-offs that cut into the very reasons Soviet aviation mattered in Afghanistan. Helicopters operating higher could not identify small ground targets with the same reliability, and the accuracy of close support degraded. Fixed-wing aircraft could still strike, but greater altitude and less time over target reduced responsiveness, especially against mobile forces using terrain for concealment. The effect was not just tactical. Soviet air dominance had been the enabler of vertical mobility, moving troops, sustaining remote posts, and delivering immediate fires to prevent ambushes from becoming disasters. When that air layer became more expensive and less dependable, the ground system strained. Garrisons still needed resupply, evacuations still had to happen, and convoys still had to move through choke points. The Stinger did not have to make flight impossible to be strategically significant. It only had to make routine flight costly enough that commanders hesitated, delayed, or accepted reduced effectiveness. How decisive this was, in pure numbers, remains debated. Some Western accounts credit the Stinger with very high success rates and a major share of shootdowns, while Soviet-era and later Russian claims argue the impact was exaggerated and that total losses from all causes were lower than often stated. What is far less disputed is the behavioral change. The Stinger forced new tactics and extensive defensive measures that reduced the effectiveness of Soviet air power, especially helicopters, the central tool of Soviet operational control in Afghan terrain. By late 1986 into 1987, the air war had shifted from a Soviet advantage taken for granted to an advantage constantly negotiated against a persistent portable threat, setting up the final question. How did this constraint interact with the wider political and economic pressures already pushing Moscow toward the exit? Those wider pressures were already real by the mid-1980s. The war was draining money, aircraft, and political credibility, and Soviet leadership increasingly treated Afghanistan as a problem to be ended rather than won. In public, the pivot became unmistakable as Moscow moved toward a negotiated exit. The agreement signed in Geneva on April 14, 1988 set the timetable for withdrawal, which formally began on May 15, 1988 and ended on February 15, 1989. The Stinger did not single-handedly force that decision, but it helped narrow Soviet options at the exact moment the Kremlin was searching for an off-ramp. When a superpower has to fly higher, strike from farther away, and limit the helicopter mobility that holds its entire field army together, the war becomes slower, more expensive, and harder to control. And that matters because Afghanistan was never just a battlefield contest. It was a contest of endurance, logistics, and political tolerance under constant loss. Declassified reporting from the period shows Soviet leaders openly grappling with the domestic and strategic fallout as withdrawal planning accelerated. By the end, the meaning of air dominance had changed. Soviet aircraft could still fly, but they could no longer guarantee control of the fight below. And once that guarantee vanished, the entire campaign's logic began to unravel. If you want more Cold War techno-thriller breakdowns like this, where a single system reshapes doctrine, morale, and strategy, like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications.